Right, so I have my lace nearly in the placement I want it. Next thing I want to do is the dark purpley pink overskirt is going to go over the top. I want it to go in that curve, so it will sort of go something like, if you just follow my finger, something like that. And I need it to finish roughly about there where that red mark is that I've put on. Now from the top the two pieces will be joined, and this will have to be straight to start with. So I've made a mark for my seam allowance, 1.5 centimetres from the top, and then because I've already done a mock-up of this and worked that bit out, I already have this already, so I know that from that seam allowance mark down to there, down to 3 inches, it's got to be straight. So in total, I'll just go back to centimetres to confuse everybody. In total, I'm looking about, from the top edge of the waist, about 9.5 centimetres down. It's got to stay straight, because then the other piece will join the seam just like you're putting a seam together. And then at this point is when it starts to slant away, so it can reveal all this beautiful lace at the front. So what I've done is I've taken another paper pattern piece, and this has been taken from the main petticoat pattern piece that I did before, but I'm just going to deal with a half. I don't need to deal with the whole thing, so I've just cut half out and we'll go from there. Okay, so I've got that mark I showed you earlier at the top. I've also made a mark at the bottom here where I want it to finish. That's along the bottom of the skirt. Now we've drawn our curve here, but we're just going to try our best to sort of show you how to do it. So this is probably the first time ever in history that my dad always appears on these videos, hence his hands. He's going to explain how you use a French curve to get the curve.
So you take your French curve and position it, get yourself a start as to what's called a transition curve. Move the French curve around to a point where you think it might be the best to give you the next part of the curve. Draw a line, move on up to the end and give yourself a start line there. Doesn't have to be the final line, and then you can use the part of the French curve that fits best to connect it up. And if you're not absolutely happy with it, you can just use that as a guide to do a freehand curve to get your final smooth line. And that gives you your guide for cutting.
Okay, so now where I had that curve we've just drawn, I've actually cut around it to reveal the curve that I'll have for the skirt. So this will just be one side, so this is the front, and then this will be the side seam here. So, and I've got that cut, that piece is now ready to go. Okay, so we're making a start on the dark purple overskirt, and I have this gorgeous polyester dupion fabric here. It has a shiny side and a matte side, and both look as good as one another. Now I've opted to not have the shiny look because I felt that makes it look a bit too, how can I say this, sort of plasticky when you take photos of it. So I thought the matte side looks just as nice, and it has like the silk dupion fabric, which is the way it's woven, you get this raw slub line going through the fabric, and this polyester version does the same, but the lines are not quite so pronounced, but you can sort of just make them out. If I hold it up in the light, there we go, you can see them there. So we've got a direction grain going on here, and you can see that the lines are going that way. Now I'm going to be cutting out my skirt, and the piece, obviously we've got this line on it going in that direction, so we want it to, I want it to sit almost straight. I did a mock-up of one on some actual silk dupion before, and I accidentally cut it in the wrong direction, and the grain line was going like sort of that way on the hoop skirt, and you could really see it, and it just stuck out like a sore thumb. So we've done a run-up of some diagrams here of where to lay the pieces, and we did these little mock-ups in some gingham fabric that has conveniently got a printed straight pattern on it, so you can see down and across. So we've got these out to try and help the placement of the pieces on the pattern, and we'll go right ahead now and start explaining what we're going to be doing. I bought the fabric off an eBay seller. This is what it was called. It said it was that wide, but actually it was a little bit wider than what they said. I think by an inch or two or something. The more you bought, the cheaper per metre it was. I got the 5 metres, and the colour was Sangria. Okay, so we're just placing our pattern pieces here on the drawing. I'm starting off with one of the front sections here, so that has been pinned down and that's ready to cut. The one thing I didn't include on this pattern was the seam allowance around the edge here in the bottom, because I decided on going with bias binding, which, just going ahead here, will have a few poppers on that's actually going to attach to the lace on the petticoat so it holds it there, but I'll explain more on that later. But for now, I've just got to remember I've got an extra centimetre just around the side and the bottom, not on the side or the waist. That's absolutely fine. And the next piece we'll cover in a minute, so I'll just get that cut first. Okay, so I've got this piece cut out. Now we're on to the back sections. Now I'm going to do the back section in 2 halves like I did the petticoat. It just makes it that little bit easier. So what we've done is trying to use a tape measure to get this straight grain of the fabric, and we've lined it up in this position. Don't do what I did and think that you've got to line one of the sides up straight and then the rest of it come this way. That's wrong. Don't do that. So match up the centre of the side and the back seam on the skirt with the tape measure, like so. And obviously make sure that you don't get too close to where you've cut your other piece. So you want to leave just a little bit of room. This also saves fabric as well, doing it this way. So I'm just going to pin that down and cut that bit out. And I will be adding a seam allowance onto the back, because yet again, like I said earlier with this piece, when I did my petticoat, I was initially going to do it in one down the back and just cut it just for the opening, but I decided not to do that, and so I just need the seam allowance on the back. But if you've already incorporated that into your pattern piece, then you won't need to do that. Okay, so I'm now doing the second back section. As before, you remember the waist was up here and the hem of the skirt was up that way. So what we've done is turn the piece over and then also flipped it the other way, so now the waist is there and the hem of the skirt is this way. Because you need to do opposites if you're obviously doing it in half. If you're doing it in one, then you don't need to worry. You can just cut it all on one side. So I'll just go ahead and pin that one and then cut it out, and then finally do the last front section. Okay, we're on the last piece, which is the second front section now. So you see I've left that exactly where it was for good reason. So we're going to turn it that way and then turn it this way, matching your grain line up with the grain line on the fabric. Make sure it's all going in the same direction. And then I'll just pin that on again and then cut the final piece out. Okay, so I've now sewn all the seams on my skirt, and remembering to leave the back opening, which will be different depending on your measurements, so that it opens, and I've ironed the seams flat. Also remember, if your fabric has a good or bad side, or whatever side you want to sew your seams the right way. As I mentioned earlier, I didn't want the shiny on the outside. I preferred the matte, which, to be honest, this fabric looks just as good each side, but I prefer less shine. So what should be the bad side actually doesn't look too bad. It's quite a nice fabric, so I've just sewn those up, ironed the seams, and that's where we are at this point. And you can see here with it all opened out, it kind of looks like a skirt but different fronts. Bit weird, but there we go. Okay, so we're just doing a quick trial fitting of the skirt before I put the bias on. We've done a temporary waistband because this will give an idea of the length. We've just been having a look at it now, sewn up the side seams just to see how it's behaving and if it's all needs cutting again, which it did in one or two places, but it wasn't too bad. So this will be it now until we put the bias binding on next. Okay, I've opted to have a bias binding edge on the skirt, and because it's on a curve as well, it does make hemming just that little bit more difficult, and because I've got quite a severe curve around towards the bottom, so I thought this would be a much better option. So I bought this, or what's called organic bias tape. It's cotton poplin, a colour fuchsia, and it's 20mm wide, or 2 centimetres. There's only 5 metres on the card though, and I measured all the way around and I need at least 7 odd metres, so there's not quite enough here, but it was the closest match I could find to the colour I wanted, just in case even when you come to press it you get that odd bit of colour coming through to the outside. So I went through all the other bias bindings and I couldn't find anything that quite matched. It was either dark red or bright purple, and then I saw this. It was a little bit pricey, but it's nice and soft as well. So what I've done is I've got the top edge of my skirt here. This is just one half. There's the back seam, there's the side seam, this is the front, and just lining up the edges along the top there. You then line the other edge right up against the edge of the fabric, and you can pin it all the way along if you want to, but I found it really annoying, so I just put a few pins in to start me off to hold it at the beginning, and then doing the rest by hand. And you can find plenty of tutorials that will tell you how to sew bias binding on, but basically I've just lined it up with the edge, and I've chosen to sew on this side where I can see it better. Obviously you want to make sure. So I've just continued round, and I've just gone as far as I can go, and I've got a bit left over here, because what I'm going to do is with the next lot I'm going to have to join it onto the end so that I can carry on right to the other side. Okay, so the next part is to press the bias binding underneath, so lifting that up and turning it and pressing it underneath, so you just see the seam there, just see me. You don't want this to roll forward like that, so you see the line underneath showing, and you also don't want to roll this too far over either. So you're aiming just to fold that along that line. I tend to roll the underneath forward a few millimetres, because I find even when I'm ironing it just seems to creep forward a little bit, so I just really try and roll it a few millimetres under, and then you want to press there firmly. Obviously test the heat on your fabric. I already know the setting I need, so that's all ready. I'll just show you doing it a bit at a time. So there we go, you can see there, press that bit there. This is the important thing, because as I was explaining earlier, if you get some sections that are too far under or too far over and you haven't lined that up right, it will end up looking quite a mess and out of shape in places. So this is quite an important part, so don't rush it, do a little bit at a time, and continue doing that all the way around to the other side. Okay, so I just showed you what it looks like from the other side, but as you iron it will be more helpful to push it over to the side. Make sure this edge stays folded over like that. Okay, so that's important. So let's start at the top there again. So now you can, it's a bit more helpful, and also this bias is slightly lighter by a shade, so that tells you then if your bias has rolled too far forward, and keeping this, as I say, this edge folded at the same time. Keep it a tiny little bit of tension on it as you go. See, there we go, I nearly rolled it too far forward then, so I'm just making sure. Okay, so that's the easier way to do it, and then you can see what you're doing. I've now sewn my bias onto the edge of the skirt, starting at the top front, going all the way around right to the other side. I've now pressed it underneath with the iron so it makes a nice neat edge. So what we have here is front openings. Okay, so the next thing I did is I tried this all on for fitting and to make sure it's still behaving and doing what I wanted. And while I was there, I've got my mock-up of my bodice, and just getting the bodice back up here. This will be on another tutorial later on. And at the front of the bodice here we've got a point at the very bottom, and I had to put it on and see where this point finished to make a mark on the two front sides of the skirt. So that's what the pin is for. So we've got the top edge of the skirts here, and we've got a mark here showing that's where the point finished. I will be adding an extra centimetre to my bodice because it is a wee bit shorter than I would like, so I will be taking that into account, but you might already have done a mock-up that is to the length that you absolutely want it to finish at. So we'll be transferring that mark to the other side as well, so it lines up, and then I'm going to show you how to join it together. Okay, so what we're going to do now is join the two front sides together from the top edge all the way down to the marks we've made, and Mum's just going to demonstrate that.
Okay, open up the bias and make sure that your seams are all pointing outwards. Line up that sewing line on this side with the sewing line on this side so they are together. You can feel that with your fingers that these sewing lines are lining up, and put your pin there. And then a little bit further down, you can feel with your fingers whether that sewing line is directly on top of the sewing line underneath. So for sewing, you're going to sew on this side of the existing sewing line. Where you've made your crease with your ironing, it's about 2 millimeters on this side, so you'll sew all the way down to your mark. Then for double strength, you can then turn it around in your machine and sew on the same sewing line all the way up, and that will give it extra strength.
Okay, so we've now sewn down that line that we were showing you a moment ago up to the point of the pins, the mark, and just turning it to the outside here, you can see we've got a nice seam up to that, I think it's a 4.5 inches with the length from top to there, so that's looking pretty good so far. And the next thing will happen is I've got the skirt in a funny place here, is that bias binding needs to turn underneath to create a nice neat edge. Okay, so this is my way of doing it, it's just easier for me. I'm going to put this little lining board arm here and a weight, and as you've already ironed it earlier, it should be naturally wanting to fold over where you've ironed it. And you want to be careful of the pins because this satin does mark, but you will need some pins to help you go round. You're just basically holding that bias round the back without pulling it out of shape. Just every 3 or 4 inches put a pin. Make sure it's all flat underneath as well, like that. And I'm just going to carry on putting pins every 3 or 4 inches all the way around it, so that when I come to sew it, it will help hold it in place for me. Once you've ironed and turned over the bias binding to the back, you then want to run a sewing line along the edge to hold it in place. So I did it on the back because it's a lot easier to see than on the front here, and you don't know where the edge of your bias is. So if you turn it to the back, you can sew on there just as well as you can on the front. and as I say, it's easier to see where you're going. So you can just see then about 3 or 4 millimeters in from the edge I've run a sewing line, and that's just visible to the outside there. You want to get a thread as matching as close as possible to your colour, so you can only just about see it, and obviously when you step back you can see it even less, so it doesn't stand out too much. So that completes that part for now. The next tutorial will be putting some swags on, so we're not doing a waistband yet at this point. It'll be just getting the swags together, so that'll be the next tutorial. Thank you very much. Please check out all my other videos. Bye! Okay, so I've now sewn the bias binding on all the way around, and we've given it a press with the iron, and we've done that all the way around the whole skirt, right to the back and then up the other side again. And I'm just trying it on now just to check that everything's working out. Which it seems to be. So Trish is very happy. Okay, so that ends that particular section for now, and the next tutorial will be working out the swags that go on the top of it.